But like basically the fundamental argument is so simple and
Hmm.
so obviously true. Like there's no meaningful way to argue against the notion that the planet must indeed have some limits and that we are going to or already have exceeded them at some point. Um, and the simple fact is that I don't think like we're now in a time where that's empirically obviously true. It's like just palpable that we have exceeded planetary limits. It wasn't when the first edition was released, but I would say that the perceptions, like the sort of like global perceptions, aren't really that different between then and now. There's some differences, but it's more like the people who were already receptive to that notion in the 1970s are more fucked up and in more of a state of psychological crisis about the realities that we're facing. But if you look at the overall, like the proportion of the population that really has any kind of meaningful responsiveness to this, or like even just like an acceptance that it's logically true, it's not really that different than it was, and so that's, I don't know, that's always, to me, that's always like the most interesting thing about any of these like scientific or technical arguments is they all invoke some kind of unarticulated worldview. There's always something about people's basic psychological framework that is going to determine whether they can like hear the message of a book like The Limits to Growth or not. I don't know.
Oh my God.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to ArtiFact number 40. I am joined by Arnold Schroder. He runs the Fight Like an Animal podcast. I've been actually a subscriber and a paid patron for a while now. I recommend you guys check that out. Most recently had a couple of episodes, I guess, little mini series on, I guess, a sort of the philosophical and practical origins of the Sasquatch myth, right? Which was an interesting discussion. Also, I guess in the bonus show that we're going to have after this, I want to ask Arnold about maybe his thoughts on IQ. I'm noticing more and more this IQ resurgence, right? Back in the day, what they used to do, if you were online in the 90s and the 2000s, they used to have tons of like jelqing and penis lengthening exercises online that you could research. But now what they do is IQ enhancement, right? People are obsessed with that instead.
Yeah.
And yet they're more or less in the same category as far as I'm concerned. So we'll discuss that. I recently took a trip to New Orleans, and Arnold has some experience in New Orleans, and I found it a very interesting city simply because it's kind of like a metaphor in some ways, I think, for not only the present day of America, but even the future of America that maybe we'll get into, plus a bunch of other topics. And right now here, we're going to get into the 1972 classic called The Limits to Growth. This was one of the kind of premier environmentalist books. In fact, I think it's maybe the best selling book on environmental science ever, right? In terms of like being publicly known, maybe only a Sound Spring is more well known, but they've had like a bunch of updates to this book. We both read the 2004 edition, and most recently they have this like update 2022 into just kind of like the modeling, right? It's based on the World 3 model of just kind of resource scarcity. What kind of limits, just literally, right, the limits to growth, what kind of limits practically does the planet have? What would they look like? What would a period of degrowth or stagnation look like, and why? And it's interesting because like you sort of see the responses to it at the time. You see the kind of victory declared over its more I guess pessimistic predictions in the 90s, and now it's totally resurging, right? Because it's been very much, I think, vindicated, even if some of the specifics haven't been vindicated. Things like, materially we haven't run out of some of the things, and food production is still, I guess like sufficient, right, in the kind of like baseline sense. But anyway, yeah, this is I think going to be an interesting conversation. I'm not sure if you, Arnold, want to say anything to start, or maybe just take it away.
I mean, yeah, the limits to growth. The first thing that I'll say about it is that, like, I started my podcast after a quarter a century of not totally consistent ecological, like, involvement in ecological politics, because what's really true about living like a life of revolutionary organizing is it's kind of like having bipolar disorder. Like, there's times when you're like, let's overthrow the government and save the world, and then there's times where you're just like all fucked up and you take a break. But for a quarter of a century, it's been like the venue for a considerable majority of my sort of like adult energies. And where I got in 2017 or so was this dual place where I felt like the external indications, I thought we were probably past a bunch of ecological tipping points for a long time before then. But in 2017, I started to feel like I was seeing them, that they were palpable and unmistakable and didn't involve theoretical inferences anymore. And, so I got to this place where I kind of like was no longer interested in like doing environmental politics per se, as I had ever known that before. And I wanted to just kind of investigate why there was such a radical range of perceptions of these issues in the first place, right? And that's ultimately what any meaningful discussion about the limits to growth comes down to, is like there's this basic reality, right? It's like people have pointed out, like, oh, they made this one resource depletion curve that didn't prove to be like precisely accurate or whatever. And it's like, yeah, okay. They said, all of these curves exist within confidence intervals, right? Like, none of them are like precise predictions. And ecological scientists so often acknowledge, they not just acknowledge, but emphasize above other, people in other disciplines, that there's always going to be like interactions between elements of a system that produce, unexpected emergent results and all that stuff. But like, basically the fundamental argument is so simple and so obviously true. Like, there's no meaningful way to argue against the notion that the planet must indeed have some limits, and that we are going to or already have exceeded them at some point. And the simple fact is that I don't think, like, we're now in a time where that's empirically obviously true. It's like just palpable that we have exceeded planetary limits. It wasn't when the first edition was released, but I would say that the perceptions, like the sort of like global perceptions, aren't really that different between then and now. There's some differences, but it's more like the people who were already receptive to that notion in the 1970s are more fucked up and in more of a state of psychological crisis about the realities that we're facing. But if you look at the overall, like the proportion of the population that really has any kind of meaningful responsiveness to this, or like even just like an acceptance that it's logically true, it's not really that different than it was, and so that's, I don't know, that's always, to me, that's always like the most interesting thing about any of these like scientific or technical arguments, is they all invoke some kind of unarticulated worldview. There's always something about people's basic psychological framework that is going to determine whether they can like hear the message of a book like The Limits to Growth or not. I don't know. But yeah, it was really weird to read something that is so central, to the environmental. Anytime I do something like that, anytime I revisit environmentalism, that invokes like my sense of the past and the history and the trajectory of the movement that I've spent so much of my life in. At this point, it always puts me into this weird emotional, it does a thing. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm feeling somewhat similar, although I wasn't like involved necessarily in environmentalism. I guess when the 2004 update came around, I was in high school and I was like sort of first getting into just like politics, political thought, that kind of thing, from a left wing bias. Just kind of like it's interesting seeing the 1972 predictions and then seeing the 2004 predictions. And seeing also now kind of like where we are, right? Because one thing that keeps coming up again and again in the text is, even in the 1972 edition, right? The 2020s, right, are always kind of dealt with as a kind of, fulcrum. Right. There's a pivot point of some sort. In 2004, it's still the case, even if like some of the specifics in 2004 also didn't pan out. Like they were, for instance, like far more optimistic, I guess, is the sense in terms of like population growth won't be as fast. Right. Yeah. They were expecting, like, I think by 2030 or 2040, like 8 billion people. And it's like, we've already surpassed that. And it's one of those things where, like, I remember, like, 20 years ago being like, oh, yeah, they're saying we're hitting like 6 billion or whatever it was, or 7 billion people. And, next thing you know, it's like I remember when 5 billion was the thing. Right. I remember when that first happened. I remember when 6 first happened, 7, 8. Right. And it's probably not going to slow down in the ways that, it's slowed down a bit, right? But in terms of hitting that peak number, we probably will have some level of growth, right? At least for another couple of decades there. But yeah, there's something special about the 2020s that I'm really appreciating now, right? You mentioned how, like, for instance, these kind of accelerations that we're noticing, they're not just in the lab now, right? They're not just part of academic studies. You could literally feel them. Last week in New York City, it's like, it was like early April, right? Temperatures are in the 80s, right? I don't have my air conditioners installed yet, right? I couldn't sleep. Walking, I suddenly now have a subterranean termite infestation that I got to deal with because of the dampness and because of the heat, right? And it also feeds into, what the book states about not only material limits, but the fact that as you start hitting those limits, more and more resources and more capital is going to be diverted to dealing specifically with the limits, and not diverted to like growth or whatever, but specifically dealing with the limits. Right now, I have to spend money on, I got to get rid of termites, I got to do this, I got to do that. Right. I'm still, like, right now I'm thinking about the fact that, well, I live in New York City. How long can I really be here before there's substantial enough flooding? Right. Because I used to live in Coney Island, and there was flooding in my basement because of Hurricane Sandy. Right. Here, living here, the flooding is going to eventually reach. I was reading about, what climate migration might look like. And it seems like people that are doing actual, like, the people that design insurance, right, in a very kind of like factual way, they're not political about it. They're like, all right, we want to make some money here off of insurance claims. How would this look like? They're literally projecting, all right, we're going to have, X number of million of climate refugees coming from New York City to Philadelphia and then to Pittsburgh, right? If they're the ones doing this and they're not being political about it, they just want to make some money, it's something that's now in my mind now, right? Am I going to be an 80-year-old man that has to flee in a fucking canoe? These are real things that we're thinking about now, and we're seeing these accelerations in real time, everything from forest fires to the fact that the amount of money that is necessary to just keep the climate refugee crisis at bay, that's also increasing. It's going to be something like $500 billion within a 10, 20 years or so, right? And again, how much capital can you actually divert? Are we going to be dealing with some sort of, insurrection, right? And if we are, it wouldn't be an insurrection that I would necessarily feel, ethical about suppressing, right? Because it's like, well, I fucking, was able to live like a hog here for X number of years, right? And they're trying to get what's theirs, right? So we're seeing this play out in real time. So
yeah, I mean, that's always been, there's a variety of sort of like commonplaces in the environmental movement that I have never subscribed to, and one that I have heard my whole fucking life that I've just been really like, are you sure? Is this notion where it's like, I don't think some variety of the statement, I don't think we're going to see significant public mobilization or political will to like do what needs to be done to address ecological issue X or Y until things get bad enough that it feels like a real like palpable crisis. And I'm like, I don't know if that's, in my observation, when you want to like redesign the whole like energy grid or something, is not when the lights went out because transformers are blowing up from the heat wave, or you're breathing in so much smoke from the wildfire that, like whatever it is, right? It's like once we're in the crisis mode, it actually gets much harder in a lot of ways to start like really redesigning our lives to for like long-term outcomes, because people are scared and desperate and uncomfortable, miserable in some very immediate way, and they just want to deal with it. And and there's like a few thresholds there, one of which is like when whatever the ecological crisis is that pushes us into like actual conflict with one another. At that point, I'm like, societies that are in significant conflict are like, that's when we always exhibit the least rational, long-term, ethical, sort of like integrated systems level behavior or whatever. And the 2020s have always been that's true. I really do feel like my whole life I've maybe partially because of the limits to growth. It's like when I look back on it, I'm like, where did I get some of my notions about what the future would be like in my head? And it's kind of weird because on one hand, it's like things are happening faster than I expected. And like reading.
And we keep hearing
that
again and again, right? It's faster than we expect, like literally every year, right? It's
year,
faster.
right.
And it's like 1,000 different details are faster than you expected.
Yeah, and it's that whole thing. It's like the first and the second derivative. It's like it's not just happening faster and faster, but it's also accelerating. The rate of change itself is growing faster. And like, but on one hand, that's true. And then on the other hand, I'm like, wait, no, this is like, I did understand, like I totally understood that the 2020s were going to be this kind of like inflection point that they are turning out to be. And one of the ways that the limits to growth curves actually do seem to be on track, and this has been true throughout the editions from the 70s to the 2004 and the update, is they show food going into a crisis before like all the other resource depletion curves are like farther out, but the food, like the rate of change gets really negative for food starting in the mid 2020s. And we are seeing like 2018 was the first year since the Green Revolution, right? Since World War II, that global agricultural output actually started to decline. And now we're starting to see significant deficiencies in various regions at various times. Harvest outputs are like actually going down, and we're seeing a lot of like analyses where people are like, conditions are stacking up, like a number of variables are aligning in different ways that really look bad. And that's what's interesting, is that it's maybe not even the mechanisms aren't what they predicted, right? They like ultimately, even though it's systems theory, it's pretty simple. They're like, oh, like when will we deplete like topsoil sufficiently, like or whatever, like when will we like literally run out of arable land, or like not have the sufficient nitrogen to put throughput into the system or whatever. But what we're seeing is stuff like agricultural output diminishing because we're having temperature variations that are too extreme from moment to moment in a region. So like plants aren't having time to harden for winter because it'll stay really warm, and then there'll be a sudden cold snap like as the weather gets more chaotic. Or like in the Central Valley of California, where I've spent some of my life, like one of the world's breadbaskets, we're having wildfire smoke in the sky for longer and longer. And like at some point, like plants need light, and so we're already seeing some plants like get tricked into thinking it's fall way too early and kind of like stop growing like way before their season should be over. And at some point that's going to align, like that, like the concentration of wildfire smoke and like the tendency towards flooding that California is exhibiting, like those factors are going to align to like wipe out, at some point we're going to see like a region level food collapse. And like that can only happen a few times in a few really important places before even people who live in affluent societies are really like experiencing, like an actual, like some real actual scarcity. And to me, that's the trigger, right? The trigger for like human conflict is definitely like food scarcity is enough on its own, regardless of what else is happening. Like regardless of how much of the world is habitable otherwise. Like, I mean, history does not have a lot of examples of food shortage. Times of food shortage being times of like peace and equanimity and sober deliberation about like solving collective problems or whatever,
Although, like historically, food scarcity often came about, specifically through like mass starvation events, which wouldn't necessarily be conducive. And that's the thing. Like if you look at like Steven Pinker or whatever, he would make claims like, well, there actually isn't that much robust empirical, like historical evidence for scarcity, causing like major wars or whatever, like before the 1800s. But it's like this is true, but then again, those kinds of events just led to like, there are no soldiers if everybody's starving. Now it's a little bit different. Now, someone in, deep in, the African, savannah, they will understand there are populations out there that do have food, that do have resources,
Totally.
and they're gonna, if they could make their way north, they will. And it's very interesting because it's like, all right, so this book constantly harps on like it being optimistic in the sense that it's not taking into account things like wars, right, and these kinds of other factors. But at the same time, and maybe it's because like I look at like market charts or whatever. But in general, what I found is that there's something about looking at a chart where it's almost kind of like it's an a priori sort of like reality, right? In the sense that, like a lot of people, like, for example, let's say like day traders, right? There's this like conflict that, between like the traders and the fundamental, the people that look at fundamentals, like, no, don't look at charts. All that matters is what's going on in the world. And people that look at charts are like, no, it's only the chart that matters. The reason why I think it's only the chart that matters is if a chart is simply the representation and the sum of every human emotion, every fundamental reality, obviously to some degree, right? It's not just going to randomly, popping up. There is some random walk, but not everything, right? If it's a sum of all those things, eventually it's going to placate and it's going to show all those things in the chart, right? And there was this paper by Gaya Herrington, I believe is in her name, in January 2020, where she's basically saying what you said, like, where she's like, all right, well, I'm doing this assessment. And she's like a financial analyst. So this is another thing. I like looking at people that are perhaps interested in making some money because they're not going to take like political, like, oh, I'm a Republican, I don't believe in climate change, right? If there is a kind of like, although I don't think in her sense it's amoral, right? She definitely seems to have like an environmentalist streak. But, someone that's coming from that kind of business side of things, she's doing this analysis, and she did this in January 2020. She's looking at limits to growth, and she's modeling how well the empirical data has tracked. And she said, you know what? It tracks it very well, right? And the least pessimistic things don't track. The most pessimistic things don't track. But generally speaking, the trend tracks. And she said something like, in January 2020, she said 2020 seems to be the year where, in general, there is now going to be some sort of subtraction in human lifespan. And guess what? COVID hit.
Exactly.
That's not supposed to be part of any, prediction model of like whatever, right, in the charts. But what do you know? It found its way somehow into the chart. Global lifespan has been cut, right? In the United States, it's by like a couple of years. Other places it's larger, some other places it's less. But the fact is, it has gone down, right? Food scarcity was not supposed to, these charts were not supposed to predict Russia-Ukraine. And yet, Russia-Ukraine happens. Food scarcity, specifically from, the kind of like Eurasian breadbasket, that's now kicking in, right? Who knows what's going to look like in the future? But, in this weird way, like you look at a chart, right? A lot of things seem to be baked into what you see would look like little random squiggles. They really are not, right? And I want to really stress this for people that are looking at charts, which is why, like, sometimes when I look at some of the models within the book, one thing that I'm personally partial to, like, so they have like various models where, you have like, growth and human well-being or whatever, everything's going up, then suddenly there's a collapse, right? When you hit a certain limit and there's no more that you could do and you haven't prepared sufficiently, so you're gonna have to deal with this kind of forced degrowth, right? And one thing I appreciate is how they say, like, well, eventually the ecological footprint is going to go down. The question is how? Are you going to make a choice about it, or are you going to be forced into it? So there's like, there's models like that. There's other ones that just kind of like forever go up, right? Which I don't think is going to happen. But one that I'm sort of partial to, and I wonder what you think about this. It's going up. Then you see this kind of like dip, a very scary dip, right? It's going to be very scary in a relative sense, because although like it might not be scary if you lived 100 years ago or whatever, if you're living through it, as you're experiencing it, something like this is going to look very severe in the real world. And then it sort of like dances around, then maybe it levels off or starts to go up again eventually. I'm sort of partial to this kind of like total, scare, right? Because I do think we eventually hit a situation where things get so bad where, whether it's an insurrection from the global south or whatever it might look like, you're going to have to deal with like a major dip. And, that major dip will especially be perceived by people like in the global north, because if you're used to like a really high standard of living and now globally everything contracts, right? You're going to really feel that in a way that somebody that's maybe dealing with hunger their whole lives, right? It's going to be a little different for them. So anyway, there's a lot there. I guess we could tackle whatever you feel like here.
Yeah, man. I mean, that's something that even before I went back and read the 2004 edition of Limits to Growth, and and started thinking about it again. I read really widely for my work, and I've been reading a lot about collapsing societies recently. And something that is like really persistently true, if you're getting back before there's a historical record, but then I think you also see it in history, is like, if you look at in the old world, civilization pretty much collapsed sometime in the Bronze Age, like all of them, Mesopotamia, Egypt, like Greece, they all kind of just went away. And there's a bunch of those of like varying, of civilizations or societies anyway, of like varying degrees of like, that we're like popularly familiar with, that experience some kind of major collapse. And when people try to piece together why, it's so interesting, because it's almost never like one monolithic variable. Like there'll be a phase where academics are like, well, was it resource depletion, or was it war, or was it like a lack of internal social cohesion, or was it disease? And then at some point they'll be like, what's weird and what you wouldn't necessarily expect is like, it actually kind of seems like this civilization got hit by all those things to an unprecedented degree simultaneously. And that's totally like, it's really weird. I mean, it's like, I don't have a convenient explanation for this at all, but it seems like over and over again. And that seems like where we're at again, where it's like the mass societies, like technological mass societies, are experiencing this unprecedented degree of like internal fissioning and sort of like, just like sort of mutual incomprehension. Like perceptions are just like more divergent than they've ever been before. All of a sudden there's all of these like threats, right? Like COVID itself, and then the possibility that a lot of researchers are really anxious about, that COVID is going to imply some long-term immunological deficiencies that'll make other diseases,
which is being so denied. It's so being
which people just cannot deal with. No,
yeah, exactly. They're just lying about it.
Yeah, and that's a way that liberals, that's a way that the Democrats and the Republicans are, it actually really mirrors climate change, where like there was this phase where the Democrats were like, it's appalling, you're not taking COVID more seriously. And now they're like, all right, we're just going to stop talking about this. Exactly the same as climate change, where they're like, it's appalling, you're not taking climate change more seriously.
I used to know such COVID geeks in 2020. Dude, they completely forget about it.
And they just like, everybody was like, okay, I cannot handle this anymore. But I mean, there's like a lot of evidence that we're going to be a lot more at risk for a lot of like just disease, for just like virulence in general because of COVID. And then, obviously like the ecological crisis, it's like all of these things are happening, and war, and just like large scale conflict between societies. Like all of these things are ramping up in a way where any one of them would seem sufficient to like cause something we'd pretty comfortable calling collapse. And it's weird. It is. It's like these things really do tend to converge. And so, the 2020s, it's like the time where we're starting to see these validations of these predictions, but there's like these weird, it's always like more complex, and there's these weird like causal factors thrown in that we weren't expecting. But then, to talk a little bit about these different like curves that they imagine, I kind of agree with you. Like, it's interesting to me because I feel like the curve, like the scenario that they projected, that they modeled, that they were trying to hype as maybe like the most desirable, was like the pure S-shaped one, right? It's where like the human population goes up to like a maximum and then it just flattens. People are like, okay, let's chill out right here. And and resource use declines, but they like model all this like increased efficiency or whatever. So they're like ultimately the index of like human well-being or whatever, like that stays steady, population stays steady, but we reduce our ecological footprint. And then like the ones in which there's we're kind of right about at the vertex of the curve, we're like right at the peak, and we're gonna have this big scary drop. But then instead of a drop all the way into like fighting over radioactive rat meat, it's like, it levels out before then, and we like have some kind of functional society, like some level of social complexity. And to me, that's actually the most desirable outcome, because I think that there's something to be said.
What level of collapse do you, because when I was showing mine, I sort of imagine it like this, not like the total collapse where we go to like 1800s.
Exactly.
Like, are you imagining a total collapse, or are you imagining like a scary dip?
No. Yeah, I'm imagining a scary dip, but not the full like we're just
exactly.
like crashing, right? But I don't think the S-shaped curve is ideal, because I think there's really something to be said for not riding right at the limit, right? Like we didn't know how sensitive the atmosphere was to carbon dioxide until it was maybe too late, right? Like when this issue started being raised in the 80s, people thought we probably could go up to like 450 parts per million CO2 before we would get like anything like dangerous like temperature rise. People really didn't know, like it was in what the early the I don't know, mid 2000s, that they finally established that maybe like 350 parts per million was the limit beyond which we would experience some like runaway climate change effects. And that was after we were beyond 350 parts per million. Like I think there's something like really to be said for like, you would kind of want a less human population and just less like resource intense, like less of an intense economy, so that we had some margin of error to like, as we experiment, in a world where we're like hypothetically developing new technologies and whatever. It's like we have like some actual margin of error, rather than being like right at the crisis and chaos point and just like trying really hard not to exceed it. Also, that would just make life easier in a lot of ways, right? Like you would just like simply put, like people could just consume more resources per capita if there were fewer people, and that would really be easier in a lot of ways.
This kind of like gradual people sort of like reduce their consumption and all that. I forget if this was specifically what the name was in the 1972 book, but in Gaya Herrington's study, she calls it the stable world model, and it's like a conscious choice, right? People reduce consumption because everybody comes together like, all right, we have to save the planet, right? It's like, which is exactly why, right? It's so kind of unlikely to be the case. And, and in her study, she's like, yeah, this clearly is not what's been happening, right? There has not been, there's been some conscious choices, but not sufficient to really offset, really what's going on. To your comment about how like, what is it about the fact that like historically, when you look at, total kind of like collapse of society, civilizations, whatever, it seems to be just a bunch of stuff all at once, right? And I can think of like two answers. The one kind of like, I guess, sort of naive statistical answer would be something along the lines of, well, generally speaking, we don't have, let's say 1,000 plagues all at once, very often, right? So when they do occur, it's usually going to be sufficient to destroy any civilization, right? So these are just kind of like statistical anomalies that just happen, every once in a while, right? And I think there's some reality to that, obviously, but it's also kind of naive because the secondary view of this that I think in more limited ways you could sort of see today is the following. At a certain point, if you kind of like push, your society in a certain direction, you're gonna lose the ability to react to things appropriately, right? It could be, because of like political, kind of like like everything just could be kind of like slow, right? And everything just doesn't really move. It could be other factors as well. One example that I often give, like when people ask why I don't vote for Democrats or whatever, one example that I could easily give is, first, like you'd play up maybe just their kind of like, liberal biases, like, oh, in 2004, would you have really preferred to have Kerry in office or a 2008 Obama presidency? And of course, most liberals would be like, of course, I prefer the Obama presidency, right? So maybe it's good in retrospect that Kerry didn't gain office. But the way that I view it is as following. Well, if Kerry would have been in office, the 2007, 2008, housing collapse and all the Great Recession, it would have occurred anyway. Not because it's like, oh, well, I expect Kerry to see something that nobody saw. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the following. Kerry would have been totally incapable of preventing it from happening, even if he did know, or responding to it appropriately when it did happen, right? And this is really kind of where we are, right? We did not get appropriate responses in 2008, right? Although, there were some, it was an austerity regime, but it was definitely better than the kind of austerity regimes that you might have had in the past. And with COVID, yes, we still clearly have, an austerity regime in the sense that spending is just kind of going down, with the exception of interest hikes were supposed to slow down the economy. Instead, what they did is they flooded the economy with, a very kind of regressive form of stimulus, right? And the kind of COVID money ran out essentially, and we're not really responding. If we're creating if we're seeing this COVID as a mass disabling event that's occurring before our eyes, we're also seeing the fact that nobody's really doing anything about it. If you do bring it up, people don't want to talk about it, right? This is really where we are. It's not even so much that statistically 1,000 things are going to come at us and we'll die off. No. We're seeing bits and pieces of these things coming, and we're not doing anything about it. Eventually, we lose that ability, right? And that's more or less kind of how the Democratic Party functions. And I want to ask you about that. At a certain point, right? You could definitely blame obviously Republicans for inaction, but I wonder if at this point it's even worthwhile to overwhelmingly blame. It's true the Republicans are the anti, they're the climate change skeptic party, but in practical terms, it seems to be going into the future, that might be less the case, because if you look at Ron DeSantis, for instance, in Florida, they have so much climate shit going on that he has to constantly put hundreds of millions of dollars for climate mitigation, because it's a swamp, right? It's going underwater, right? If you have constituents there and you want to win re-election, people in those kinds of vulnerable, red states, they might end up, very much speed running some of this climate stuff that, elsewhere might be a little less important to you, right? So, there's a factor like that, right? And there's also the fact that at a certain level, it's well, it's true that we have a climate skeptic party, but if you have a party that is, on the other hand, saying, no, this is a big deal, this is so bad, and look, we're actually solving the problem right now with I don't know, the Inflation Reduction Act or whatever, that's a lie, right? That's a lie that breeds complacency. It's a lie that breeds, total inaction, right? And who knows if long term this is going to be the thing that because if you had half of the country that really did treat this so seriously, we're not going to fucking vote for you unless you really have a true green infrastructure plan, that would really be the thing that changed the calculus, right? As opposed to, oh yeah, look, he actually did something about it. Look, X, Y, and Z. Look, this piece of legislation, that, right? And before you know it, it's you wake up, right? And and it's not going to look like a huge tidal wave engulfing your house, right, in Coney Island or somewhere else in New York City. What's it going to look like is there's going to be some storm. Your house is no longer habitable. Maybe you didn't have the proper insurance and you're out of luck, right? That's really what it's going to look like practically, right? You don't have to have these Armageddon scenarios. You see the drip occurring right now.
Yeah, I mean, I always make this case that when you interact with people who are in interpersonally abusive relationship, you see these dynamics, where people can't really come to terms with that very fact. And I think the exact same thing is true at collective levels, right? When we're in an abusive power dynamic at a society-wide level, a lot of people just literally can't come to terms with that and acknowledge. And to me, people's continued insistence that the Democratic Party is going to radically change course and do something, like take a set of actions that in any sense match their rhetoric on climate, is like really strong evidence that people have some kind of weird, there's no way to understand that except psychologically, right? That makes no sense, you know. And if you look at the history, okay, so like democratic presidential administrations in my politically active lifetime, it's like you have Clinton with the world trade, you know, like the beginning of those world trade deals with NAFTA and the WTO and all that, which corresponds to, and this is like, you know, I mean, in a more broad global sense, this is just like a function of the, you know, the end of the Soviet bloc and all that, but it corresponds to an increase in the resource intensity, including the greenhouse gas emissions intensity of a unit of economic activity by like a huge factor, right? Like, you know, like our economy and society just got more poisonous and destructive, not less, under Clinton, in this way that, you know, did not happen under H.W. Bush and did not happen under W, right? And then Obama, you see a doubling of U.S. oil and gas extraction.
Yeah, that collapses the prices, and everybody's using dirty fuel again. What do you know? Emissions are getting, it's, you know,
and completely locks in an emissions curve that's just incompatible with any, you know, I mean, like any. So it's like, and again, it's like, you don't, like, Trump didn't achieve anything remotely analogous. And again, it's like, it's because of these like broader dynamics, like that just happened under Obama because fracking came, and like other forms of extreme fossil fuel extraction, like tar sands mining and whatever else, came online during his administration, you know. But he still, like, he intentionally like facilitated the construction of a bunch of infrastructure that was necessary for that extraction to happen, you know. And so it's like, whatever else those people have to say, I mean, at a certain point, like, if you're like comfortable with this disconnect between rhetoric and deed, where you're like, no, they really mean it this time, like, I know they did some bad things before, but I swear it's all like an accident or a vast mistake or misunderstanding, like, that's on you, you know. That's because like your head is all messed up from being in this abusive relationship. And yeah, so I mean, I think that notion that like I can't articulate any meaningful fundamental difference in terms of policy between the parties or whatever. And yeah, I mean, I think that there is an argument to be made, you know, when we look at all of these different causes for collapse that are all kind of converging into this like one spectacular catastrophe. I think there is kind of an argument to be made that that's something you would expect from societies attaining like a certain degree of material stability and affluence for a certain period of time, right? And it's like, you see throughout the kind of like historical and the anthropological record, it's like people's sense of identity in like a cultural group is often the strongest and the most expressed at a margin where they come up against some other group, right? Like, people build a sense of identity in contrast to other identities and other, you know, people, right? And for a while, when a group, when a society, whatever, like when a shared material reality between people is like sufficiently rocky and subject to sufficient like outgroup threat and stuff, it's like people really maintain a sense of cohesion because of that, and they're able to like undertake collective action problems, you know, like, oh, it's World War II and we don't have enough shit, all right, like, let's ration. And people will really do it, you know. And then, but then at a certain point, if things are stable and affluent for long enough, people start to build their sense of identity in opposition to other people within their society instead of outside of it. And we are definitely at that point. And then when collective action problems come along, like COVID or like climate change, you know, if one faction of society takes a position where they're like, oh, we got to do something about this, other people are automatically going to react and be like, no, that's a crazy conspiracy theory. Like, no, we don't. That's part of your crazy agenda or whatever, right? Because we enter this mode. And like, I do think there's something to be said for this idea that like on a really broad level, like what we're going through has parallels in like the collapse of a lot of societies that just like got kind of, you know, decadent or whatever. I know that's like kind of right-wing coded terminology, but it's like pretty, you know, you can map that out in terms of like neuroscience and stuff and be like, we just got too used to like a certain, like accessing a certain level of reward really easily without a lot of effort. Like we just kind of like got less good at navigating hardship, and we got less good at like individual sacrifice on behalf of collective ends. And here we are, because I mean, I just don't like at a certain point I had to acknowledge in the course of my political work, like it's all about there being a certain level of social cohesion. Like any conceivable political response to the ecological crisis, whether it's in institutional politics or whether it's a more like revolutionary approach, it's all predicated on people having some kind of shared worldview and like having some, like sharing any kind of set of terms to understand the world in. And that's less and less true every day.
Yeah. And one thing that I want to just like re-emphasize about the book is I mean, we said earlier about like there's certain aspects of it are just like totally undeniable. I think the greatness of the book remains like irrespective of some of the like individual, and again, let's not call them really predictions, because that's not so. Like first, let's just say there's a difference between like modeling versus making a prediction, right?
Right.
People don't like lay people don't seem to understand that, but then again, it's like, well, how much of this is just kind of like a lay people decrying it versus, I mean, like a lot of the time, right, the economists and philosophers or whatever responding to it that should have known better, right? They were making these kinds of silly arguments, right? Where especially like by the 90s, right? People that should know better, right? Like this didn't pan out, that didn't pan out. A model is just like, it's just kind of like establishing parameters, right? Parameters of possibility, right? You could sort of fall outside the bounds, you could fall within the bounds. Models in some level, right? They're written in a way to be falsifiable. There's nothing wrong with the process of falsification, when it actually pans out, right? But we want to pay attention actually to to the trends themselves. And one thing that I appreciate, although like obviously I researched the climate and I've been thinking about politics and all of that for a long time, just reading it, I really kind of reappreciated just the very, very basic idea, like just the basic idea of like material constraints, right? The fact that there is a planet, there is something called, finite resources, right? And also just kind of like when they describe specifically what the interactions are between some of the limits, like they're very kind of intuitive, but you don't necessarily think about them. Like for instance, like all right, let's say that you do hit upon a limit, right? And you find a way to transcend that limit. Fine. But the fact is, if you transcend one limit, all that does is it simply provides yet another limit in the future. And then if you transcend that another, you will, eventually, right? Assuming that even if you are like a very kind of noble and ingenious kind of species, right? Eventually, you're going to hit something that even if you do eventually transcend it, it's going to cause significant hardship along the way, right? This is why, like, I would consider myself when it comes to like anything in the world, environment, whatever. Like, I am cautiously optimistic in the sense that I do believe that 5 centuries from now, we'll have a much, much better civilization than we have right now. But I am, unlike somebody like Pinker, I'm much like right now, as we're living through it, I want to be able to focus specifically on those dips and those hardships along the way. Because again, even if you believe in this arrow of progress, the fact is, like, as you're living through it, you're going to have moments of stagnation. You have to be able to identify those moments of stagnation as you're living through it. At a certain point, if the Democratic Party becomes like that stagnation, you're going to have to say it and you're going to have to act accordingly. I mean, the Whigs used to be, stagnation when it comes to what is the issue in the 1800s, right? It's slavery. Well, guess what? It's not slavery anymore. But the people that are just so willing, right, to just go along with Democrats no matter what, they would have been voting for slave owners in the 1800s. And they sort of, they're like, oh my God, how could you say this about me? That no way. But that's only because like, we've gotten past that, right? Now we have a new thing to deal with. But in your time period, as you're living through it, yes, it becomes much more difficult to accept certain realities, right? And one of these realities is like what happens with material constraints, right? What happens with these limits? And also, like, another very obvious observation that I didn't quite think about before, but it's true. If you do hit upon a limit, and it's going to cause stagnation, right, in human welfare, among other problems. Right now, you have resources that are going to both those things, human welfare, as well as how do we correct for this limit, right? That means human welfare is going to have to take a hit along the way, right? Even if the argument is something like, well, human welfare is going to take a hit so that eventually we could get back to baseline. That's going to be part of the equation. So, I mean, it's important to remember that, right? And yeah, like no matter what the specific models set along the way, like if you look at, they had like a 1973 film, or maybe 1974, like Limits to Growth, where they had some of the authors, and one of the big things in the movie was just over and over again, they were like harping on things like, our stores of copper are going to disappear. Yeah, all of that, turn out to be not true, but clearly other limits are there that we're hitting upon, and we're seeing them. Like it's one of those things where like people want to so badly nitpick and get on those little specifics because that overall trend is just so scary.
Oh, totally. I mean, one of the funniest limits that turned out to just really not be true is they, in common with many, many other people, thought that there was a sharper limit on fossil fuel extraction than there turned out to be, right? And then at the same time, they thought there was much less of a narrow constraint on the amount of carbon dioxide that we could emit into the atmosphere. So those two errors, like when you sum them together, they don't spell less catastrophe, they spell more, and it's like, but yeah, I mean, it's like, of course, I totally, like, I feel like anybody who's like approaching the work in good faith understands that they're not making explicit predictions. They're illustrating a dynamic, and the dynamic is obviously like real, and we're encountering forms of it. But I mean, it's interesting. There's an amazing kind of like complement, I guess, to the limits to growth. Is this book written by the systems theorist? I think he was trained as a physicist, but he's very much in that like systems world, like Santa Fe Institute, like scene. This guy, Jeffrey West, and he wrote a book called Scale. And it's like him kind of going through, in general, sort of like going through these disciplines and taking a physicist's approach, like a physicist's approach to biology, where he's looking for universal mathematical laws. And he's like, oh, look, like it turns out there's a law of proportionality between body size and lifespan, stuff like that, stuff that biologists don't often do, because they don't think like physicists. But he comes up with this thing where he basically articulates these limits to growth, that exist across this insane range of different systems, right? That's the thing that systems theorists love to do now, is be like, hey, look how we found this dynamic that applies to like allometric growth of like the bodies of organisms, but also the growth of cities, but also like the behavior of whole economies or whatever. But his trip is basically like, in all of these systems, he does find these limits to growth, and that a way that he thinks about them is that as innovation increases, the number of crises it engenders increases, and you can often find solutions to them at first. And we already have a history of that, like the Green Revolution in the mid 20th century is one example, right? Where like industrialization created a level of population growth where there was going to be global famine. And then they came up with like the kind of, basically the agricultural techniques that we're more or less still stuck with, artificial fertilizers and all the rest, where they like massively increased agricultural output for at least a few decades. And, so they staved it off. But his point is that you create, like, as you go along, you create crises faster and faster and faster that you have to solve in real time, and it's like, if you go back far enough in the history of life, there was a time when there weren't organisms that were capable of decomposing a lot of the molecules that organisms made. And so it's like analogous to a pollution problem. It's like there were these organisms that were like utilizing resources, but they weren't being cycled back into the system. And so you could think of it as like a crisis, this very like long-term crisis, like the bodies of all these microorganisms are just like littering the world forever. and then finally an enzyme evolves to take care of it, and it's like that enzyme was allowed like millions of years to come into existence because the system was working really slow. And now we're at this point where it's like, oh, fucking plastics, like let's figure out a microorganism that can like eat plastic or whatever, and let's do it like in 10 years or something, because other, it's like we're at this point where these crises are just like being engendered faster and faster. So yeah, I mean, some like we're going to transcend some of those limits with some innovation or another, and we've already seen that. And then we're just going to have a different crisis, and we're going to have to solve it even faster. And that's exactly where we're at.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, if you originally go what I referenced to, like, like a naive kind of like statistical view of the world, well, even just purely on that naive view, that is like often shared by these kinds of like like very sort of optimistic type of progressives. Statistics would tell you that eventually, like, yes, you do hit upon a limit that is too difficult to breach for X amount of time. And I mean, historically, obviously, we see this all the time. Right. We see this like in various kinds of wars that come and go, right? Plagues, it takes a while to get back to some kind of baseline. There's nothing actually preventing us from hitting a similar set of problems. And granted, like maybe overall, like people's livelihoods would be better, than they would have been under similar crises centuries back. But generally speaking, like that's not the way it's going to be perceived as you go through it. And like some of these charts, like to the extent that they exist, like if you get like a logarithmic chart of it, it would probably really put things into perspective for a lot of viewers, because with a logarithmic chart, you get to see the changes as not in the kind of absolute sense, but as they're being experienced. Like if you could imagine like a chart of the S&P 500, going back to the 1800s, like for a while, it just looks like a flat line. And then suddenly it's like a vertical line, essentially. That doesn't look like much to you. But if you look at a log chart, it's like, well, you see all the different like little squiggles that this is how people lived, right? Somebody died in that squiggle. Somebody was born in that squiggle, right? Somebody committed suicide because of this wick, right? That like maybe there's a wick that's just in a 1 minute time scale, right? But some guy leveraged so hard that he lost everything, right? All those little squiggles, right? They form some sort of baseline reality. So, eventually, just like again, even just like pure, statistical naivete, you hit a limit that is going to be hard enough that even if it's something to be transcended in the future, you're going to have to deal with, in a kind of like logarithmic fashion, like this, the feeling that, wow, we really are going backwards. And if we are used to a certain kind of level of, affluence or whatever else, what exactly is that going to do? Because like, think about how like, even with some of the, like, even if like we're better off in many ways than let's say like under slavery, there seems to be so many like social fractures. And sometimes I think it's like, why? Like over what? Like there's social fractures over like fucking like putting on a mask or not. Are you fucking insane? There's a political platform over masking and not masking. It's just totally insane, right? It seems like the more that we're able to, kind of like get into our own heads and abstract up from like base material reality, the more that any kind of like, like foundational little squiggle, like anything that's happening on the foundation that would normally not have an effect, now it just knocks us off our feet, So.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's like, I think again, that's that thing, like there has to be literally the only scientist I've ever known of who addressed this directly was this guy, Peter Sterling. He's a neuroscientist. And he was like, we have to take seriously the notion that we just can't address environmental issues because our nervous systems have been rewired by consumer civilization in this way where like a level of just like navigating like certain material, like, deprivations or like readjustments of, our basic material reality that you would not describe as like massive hardships in any kind of broader historical perspective are just like maybe things that we're really not capable of in, just like in our current sort of like dopamine regimes, that our reward circuitry as it currently exists just cannot do voluntarily. And yeah, I mean, it's really hard to know what, I don't know. I mean, like, I guess I always think about, like, to me, like thinking about this thing and imagining a curve that does go down, right? Where there's like a decline in a bunch of metrics of, like, population, human well-being, whatever, material throughput in the economy, but then stabilizes before it's like annihilation of everything. Um, to me, it's like there's this big question of like, what is the crisis that is sufficient to kind of like realign people's perceptions, but not so severe that everybody's just fighting for like minuscule scraps. It's like, to me, I always imagine this kind of like golden level of crisis, right? That somehow like increases rather than decreases social cohesion, and like, just somehow, and maybe it exists and maybe it doesn't, but I feel like, as far as sort of like, if you're somebody who's like, well, what can we do to guide the system towards better rather than worse outcomes? To me, that's really probably the only thing you can realistically think about, right? Is that you're hoping to build something that can be kind of like asserted in a moment of tumult, and provide some kind of framework for like, I know I'm using really general language because I don't know what it is. But to me, that's the thing. That's the big question. But yeah, exactly. Like, people have gotten, I mean, there's that like famous sociological research. Like, I think that goes back to like Durkheim or whatever, that people commit less suicide in times of like material deprivation, right? Like, people committed less suicide during the Blitz in England or whatever,
Yeah,
getting bombed
because
by
you
the
you have no
Nazis,
time to think about that bullshit.
because you
you
don't have
have
time to
no
be
time to
alienated.
you have no time to be depressed. You have no time to be, it's like one of those things like people are like constantly seeking, happiness. I want to be happy. I want to be happy. But it's like
Exactly.
just like fill your life with work, and it's like you're not gonna be thinking about any of that. But like for whatever reason, like things are gonna get done, and you're gonna feel good. I don't know about like happiness, but like that's a totally, that's another thing. Like civilization has more recently geared itself towards these like goals like happiness that are just kind of like, if you think about it, they're very silly, right? Because being goals in and of themselves are very empty, and ironically those are the kinds of goals that would lead to more and more suicide. um
Well,
so
and
so
there's
yeah.
research in those very terms that the more people focus on individual happiness, the less happy they actually are, right? The
Yeah.
less satisfied with their lives. Like, yeah, exactly. It's a very silly way to look at the world. But like, I
Yeah.
remember a way that I think about it a lot. I can remember being a kid and being like, really, this leaving a huge impression on me. And then like, it turned out to be a major sort of like frame for examining the world in adulthood. Was like, part of my childhood was spent in rural Vermont, and the power would go out kind of a lot in winter,
Mhm.
and those really, like, at some point I was like, wow, I really like these days better. Like, I'm happier on these days when we don't, this is fucking awesome. Like, we only cook over the wood stove, and like, there's no like, I'm not distracted by anything else. I just like read books and hang out, and like, it's just awesome. But I was like very aware. I was like, yo, I could do this anytime, but I'm not ever going to get up the personal initiative to forego all of these conveniences and these like immediately accessible sort of like reward stimuli that having electricity offers. Like, it's only going to happen when the power goes out on its own, but then I'm
Mhm.
happier, and it's like,
Yeah. I've definitely noticed situations like that where you're just like you're stuck and you can't do anything other than read. And it's like all those days that you feel like, oh my God, I'm so busy, I don't have time to do this, I don't have time to do that, and then suddenly it's like, wow, I could really technically do whatever that I want to do, right? If I only sort of like shape up, right? It really just, it's like a personal thing, right? It's one of those things where the material constraint is actually you. Like I did the show recently on Nietzsche's The Gay Science, and he has this part in the book where he says something like, one of the greatest innovations that we've been able to come up with was like the advent of religious war. uh, and this is coming from somebody that in some ways like hated religion, but he said something like, because with religious war, right, that proves that human beings have finally started to take concepts seriously, right? And yeah, like because it's just kind of odd how, you know, we because you were talking about recently in your last two shows, like human nature and what we're capable of versus not capable of, how the parameters of that are just always distorted, you know, by left wingers, by right wingers, right? You have left wingers that say stuff like, you know, we have absolutely no constraints, no parameters whatsoever. We could do whatever that we want, right? Without any necessity to change incentives or like whatever. And then you have right wingers that say like, no, everything has to be a patriarchy. You know, we need to have an alpha male with like 1,000 concubines. And that's just kind of the way of the world. But realistically, right, there are, you know, some parameters, and yet within these parameters, how concepts play this role, like that is like fairly new, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think we like, one thing about Nietzsche that's wonderful, especially for a left winger who would disagree with like much of what he says, is there's enough there where you could start building out your own systems and your own beliefs, right? Based on maybe some of those individual nuggets. And he really did see, you know, so much about the future. And he, you know, would keep saying that, you know, we haven't figured this out yet, and it's going to be a while before we do, right? And, you know, he was talking about spans of centuries, and that seems to be correct, right? We haven't truly, you know, dealt with what it means to be, you know, like conceptual animals, right? And how we get away, you know, to ourselves, how we sort of, you know, like all these questions, right? You know, everything from self-sabotage to, you know, just like human potential, right? It's a much more difficult set of questions than I think anybody is. It doesn't matter what your political beliefs are. I think there's always this incentive, no matter what you believe, to not really think about that really, because again, it's painful, it's difficult, especially if like in the bottom line, like even if you're a left winger and you believe in like, you know, helping the welfare state, blah, blah, blah. The bottom line is ultimately whatever happens in life is more or less going to be up to you, right? Even if you deserve so many things you're not getting, right? By virtue of the fact that you're not getting them, you know, it really falls upon you to either get them or not, right? There's no, you know, because when you die, it's like you either did these things or you didn't, right? So and that's also that's a scary thought for left wingers, but also it's a very, very scary thought, it seems, for right wingers. That's why they're so intent on control, right? There's this desire to control because they're fearful of these outcomes. They're fearful of personal. They talk about personal responsibility because they're scared of it, right? They're scared. They're scared of it so much, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of their rhetoric about personal responsibility actually comes down to this like fear where they're, you know, where they like insist that if you just like behave reasonably, you can achieve whatever. Comes down to this like terror that that's not always true, right? That life just is going to throw things at you that are beyond, you know, and yeah. But yeah, I mean, I feel like I feel like that, yeah, like that obviously applies to like, you know, the notion of ecological limits. Like it would be this very unprecedented phase of human behavior where we're taking, you know, where like abstract awareness about something actually like motivates how we fundamentally are in the world in a way that, you know, doesn't have a ton of historic precedent. And like one of the things that the book really, one of the ways that the book really hit home, the 2004 edition, was like, you know, I'm always like, I'm super aware that most people with like left-wing politics do not have what I would call like ecological politics, or like more generally just like an ecological frame of awareness. Like they're super uncomfortable with the idea that the world does have limits, or that there might be like, you know, any sort of and it's kind of like in much the same way that a lot of people on the right have a perception of the police that comes from action movies, I really think a lot of people on the left have perceptions of ecology and technology that come from science fiction films. I truly think that there's something to be said for that notion. And you know, so like it's so interesting to me to see how I talk all the time about how like we used to be able to talk about population, and it wasn't assumed that that was like one step away from some genocidal discussion. And they do that in the 2004 book. They're like, the answer to the like this crazy like population curve we're on is more education and a better, like a more equitable distribution of resources, right? They're like poverty generates like significant population growth. And they point out something that the Steven Pinkers of the world won't look at. They're like, the more economic growth we have, the more inequality there is in the world. And so you're not going to get rid of like the population curve that we're on by just like growing the economy more, but like that used to be something that was like really, really just normal to talk about. And now there's like such a left-wing reaction to like any discussion about population. And to me, this is just like any other aspect of our lives that we might wish to consider and rationally manage, like I don't see why, like the notion that the only way that population could ever be like assessed or anything could be done about it would be in terms of like some sort of horrible, like reactionary genocidal program. It doesn't make any sense. It's just not true, right? The other thing that we could do is just have a rationally deliberative, process about it and be like, what's an optimal population? Like, in conditions of relative material affluence and education, it's like there are significant life, like wellness trade-offs to having children, right? It's like not easy or fun in a lot of ways. And a lot of people don't want to do it when they're given the opportunities to pursue other avenues. And I mean, it just seems like really like kind of a no-brainer that we should be able to discuss that. But that's something that's changed in my lifetime, where like the left has always been really basically pretty hostile to environmental like thinking in a lot of ways, but that population one has become way more pronounced, and it's really too bad because it'd be nice if we could actually talk about it.
Yeah, there's this kind of growing convergence, right, on like left and right wing thinking when it comes to population, right? Like recently, like I saw like some tweets by that Richard Hanania guy, right? Who is he seems to be having this kind of little, meltdown over some like Korean kid who was like, oh, like I don't want to have kids because I saw what my parents had to go through, how they had to struggle, give me all of these, tutors, blah, 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 blah. And he compared it to like, well, that's like saying, you're not going to have kids simply because you can't have like a, a 5-star meal, 5 times a day, whatever. But it's like, no, well, first of all, like in Korea, the baseline reality is like, either you're going to get, like all these tutors and you're going to get all this, training and whatnot, or you're not going to be, gainfully employed, right? Or at least employed in the way that you want to be employed, right? So that's kind of like a baseline reality for a lot of people. And the fact is, as things are heating up, like one thing I'm noticing is that just everything in general seems to be getting much more competitive, right? Like we used to have some level of, I don't want to say like shared abundance, right? Because you don't want to like downplay everything really what was going on, underneath that. But it didn't have to be like, even I don't know, even something like having like a YouTube channel today versus 5 years ago, right? COVID, if people are working from home and they want to do this, they want to like, things are getting more competitive in that regard. Like I remember like seeing for the first time in my life, I started seeing all these like, YouTube ads in like 2020, 2021 about like day trading, right? And it's like the scammiest ads possible, but it's like, well, if people are staying home and more people are trying to get into this, things are going to get more competitive, right? Everything seems to be getting, land is getting scarcer, obviously, right? There's more people, which means that per acre, right? Just mathematically, there's going to be, fewer acres for X number of people. So like when it comes to population specifically, it's like they feel like this is like this infringement upon desire, which it kind of is, right? I mean, if they always like bring up the China one-child policy, and it's like, well, China sort of like did a major positive for the world, and they don't even fucking appreciate it, right? They had to bear the brunt of like I don't know like to what extent like forced abortions or whatever were like the norm or whatnot. But the fact is, people in China had to bear the brunt of all these restrictions, but they restrict, who knows what the population look like now. and to what extent this would play into both, you know, environmental degradation as well as like, you know, into, you know, food scarcity or whatever. Also, they did the world a kind of favor. Everybody's looking askance at it because it's a restriction on freedom. But when people start talking about like freedoms in that way, when it comes to like personal desires, it's like, well, at a certain point, it is true that your desires and your freedoms, they start to infringe on somebody else's, right? And it tends to be, guess what? People that conveniently are so, you know, you don't get to see them, you don't have to deal with them, you don't have to think about them. They're just this kind of like lump in mass in the back of your mind. Every once in a while you see them in a commercial, every once in a while somebody says a phrase like the global south. And although I say that phrase a lot, the fact is I don't, you know, interact with people, you know, from Africa in any kind of like normal basis, right? It is always going to be a kind of abstraction to me until it can't be any longer, right? So there's this kind of like very odd convergence, left, right on this question, and both would deny it, and yet, and they're both approaching it from like, you know, this kind of like standpoint of like pure desire and like me.
Exactly.
That's the other odd part. Like for Elon Musk, it's like this fucking, it's like a mix of like Genghis Khan type shit where he wants to have like 1 million kids by 1 million different women, right? And also like he wants to have millions more consumers for his products, right? And millions more, you know, going to Mars. Like he to him, like the ultimate dream would be like we saturate the planet so much that everybody has to go to Mars because there's no other, you know, there's no other solution, right? So like there's all these like very weird incentives, and also just like, you know, just like this like inner child coming out. And you know, there's nothing wrong with an inner child, but when it's done for the most kind of like self-indulgent purposes, like you have to be able to see through it, right? It's not anything more than that. Like I don't, you know, like I'm so tired of hearing people like, well, I want to have 10 kids, like just like, you know, it's just, not only is it just kind of like show kind of like how hollow a human being, like who's the kind of like the poster child right now for, you know, too many kids, right? Mia Farrow, right? 20 fucking kids. She doesn't know their names half the time, right? She has to Google. Like one time she Googled a photo of Mia Farrow's black children to say happy birthday on Twitter or like something like that, right? Like it's just like, it's so alienating, right? And it's the exact opposite of what they claim it is. So
I don't know. I mean, it's just like this fundamental thing, like somehow ecological issues got kind of coded. Like there was a time, you know, up until I guess about the 70s, ecological issues really didn't have much of a right-left valence to speak of, you know, like there were like, I mean, most of federal environmental law in the US was signed into law by Nixon, and he was super like avid about it at the time, you know, and somehow it got like coded left, but it's really not. It's really like just a distinct set of concerns and considerations. And yeah, it like part of it,
and
like
it should be conservative psychology, though, you know, like finite resources. If you're a circumspect, like it's supposed to be conservative. As a conservative who is of that psychology, you're supposed to be scared of, you know, things being finite, and you're supposed to treat the planet with respect, right? Like,
and supposedly you're alarmed about social structures changing in chaotic new directions or whatever. But it's like, if you're just going to embrace every technology and every, like, you know, be like, oh yeah, let's like mine all the rare earth minerals to make as many cell phones as possible or whatever. It's like, it's not it's fundamentally not conservative either. But yeah, you know, it's like just basically some of the core psychology that distinguishes ecological thinking from people on both the right and the left is seriously just like an adult capacity to acknowledge that life isn't always like exactly how you want it to be, and you have to navigate the material realities that you inhabit. And but then also interestingly, I feel like in terms of social structure, there's so much to be said for like there being a real opening of social possibility with like a lower human population density. And that of course is like relative to technology. It's relative to the mode of subsistence you have. But like, I really think that there's something to be said for, throughout human history, in times when societies have become untenable in some way or another, like one of the ways to deal with that is to like have a revolution or whatever. But then the other way to deal with it is to go somewhere else, to just like set up shop somewhere else and do something new. And it's like, I really think there's something to be said for deliberately making sure that our societies, our resource consumption, our populations exist at a level where there's still like a frontier, like a hinterland, you know, where it's like there is like enough, not just enough for everybody, but more than enough for everybody, and like places where people aren't like already densely, you know, inhabiting, so that people can continue to just like experiment. Like there's a real freedom in that, that any vision, whether it's right, whether it's left, but any vision of like a massively dense population where everybody's inhabiting like one monolithic system and there's no way out, like even if the system is like pretty good in a lot of respects, that's still like this fundamental constraint that I think the world would be better without. I really do.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much more we have to say about the book specifically, but just like this general, I guess, climate discussion. So like, what exactly, like based on your research and your own thinking about this, what do you think is going to happen in terms of like the final numbers, right, when it's all said and done, in terms of like, because I remember, I forget, I've been trying to find this paper again because I read it like maybe 3 years ago or so. It seemed to be very robust, and it said something like, okay, well, it seems pretty obvious now that we're going to hit past, right now we're around like 1.1 Celsius warming, and there's like, all right, so that benchmark of 1.5, we're going to go past that, and most likely the parameters are going to be like somewhere between like 2 and 3.9. Is that kind of like your sense? Like, do you think we're going to be hitting those sort of like higher end numbers? Because just to tell the viewers what this really means, like if we hit actually 4 Celsius, substantial parts of like even America are not going to be, you know, inhabitable any longer, right? Tons of like land in the world will essentially just be like, you know, a desert for solar panels, right? That will, you know, in a more kind of sustainable fashion, you know, feed what will be kind of not the global north, but just more or less the north, because that's where people are going to live, right? So that those are the implications of like 4 to 5 degrees of warming. Where do you think we might end up falling ultimately when it's all said? Like,
Yeah.
and what would the world actually look like? Because that's another thing. Like sometimes when I look at what the predictions are in terms of what the world will look like with this amount of warming, like it's not always, you know, people disagree about it. So what do you think is going to be the kind of situation?
Yeah, man. I mean, like I see, so and it's not the most satisfying answer, but I see tremendous uncertainty. Like I see a probability curve that has like a fat probability curve over a huge range of outcomes, and those all just involve fundamental uncertainties in the response of the Earth system to stuff we've already done or like definitely going to do. And so, like to give an example, you know, it's like um the end Permian is the biggest mass extinction in the Earth's record. It came about largely through the liberation of like methane deposits, you know, that were like sequestered somewhere or other. It's very clear that we have triggered the release of a bunch of like subterranean, you know, and sub-sea surface methane. We just don't know how much yet, but that's obviously a feedback loop, you know. But then like, so that, you know, that gets into like I think it's possible like that we will live in a world that doesn't have oxygen and where the vast majority of species are not around from what we've already done, you know, if the set of feedbacks plays out like it has at other times in the Earth's past, right? But also, you know, just like to take that example, there's also these bacteria that consume methane that hang out in places where, you know, like there's methanogenic, you know, like whatever, like permafrost and methane hydrates in the sea or whatever. And we don't know how those populations will flux and respond to increasing levels of methane coming out of, you know, the ground and out of the sea, right? There's just like so many feedbacks like that that have the potential for like a level of catastrophe that's literally like geological, you know, that's like, well, like maybe the sky will turn a different color whatever, like it did in the end Permian, or maybe not. And I just don't know. Like, I think there's also just this real, I think I've only seen one paper that explicitly addressed it in these terms, but I think there's this big question about whether we'll enter a kind of stable, like warm regime, or whether we'll enter a long period of chaos. And like really either is super possible. And a stable warm regime would mean that things reconfigure, but there's still like plenty of habitable terrain. But chaos is like a lot harder to navigate, and it's like the Earth, the Earth had the level of atmospheric carbon dioxide that it does today. Like, what was it? It was some time. It was some time when there were like mammals, it was like when life was like somewhat fundamentally like recognizable, like it had some kind of like similar forms as it does today. So like maybe we'll just get something like that. That would be nice, But I think that there's like, to me, the essential point is that there's no way to know, but that it is actually totally reasonable to speculate that we're gonna reach levels of like feedback induced warming that most life forms won't be able to endure. Like like there was that paper last year that James Hansen, who used to run NASA's Goddard Space Center or whatever, he's like the guy who testified about climate change to Congress in 1988 or whatever it was, but he was like really considered like the nation's premier climate scientist for a long time. And he and a bunch of other people wrote a paper in 2022 saying that they thought there were 10 degrees of warming baked into the system, like from what we've already done, just from feedbacks basically. And like, I'm not saying that's definitely true, but it's definitely a possibility. It's definitely a possibility. And so that, like, unfortunately, like just the range of uncertainties with the feedbacks means that I don't know, man. Like, I think from like actual anthropogenic emissions, like before stuff gets so inevitably chaotic that we just can't emit at the same scale, like, yeah, we're probably going to hit somewhere more than 2 and less than like 3.5 degrees. But the feedbacks are the thing. That's the massive uncertainty that could add another like 5-6 degrees to the equation, and like pretty much nothing is going to survive that, which again has happened in Earth's history.
Yeah, one thing about the more kind of like chaotic feedbacks is I notice not that much discussion of them. I don't know if this is because, like, I mean, just kind of like scientifically, they're much harder to discuss like in objective terms because by its nature, it's just kind of, there's so many unknown variables there. But a lot of it, again, is just kind of like it's one of those things where people would prefer to sweep that under the rug. I mean, my instinct says that even with like, I think like we'll definitely get past 1.5 and probably past 2. And, I could very easily see us hitting, anything as high as like 3 or even a little bit higher. And like when you see like types like, Matthew Glacius or whatever discuss climate change, they're always framing it in terms of survival and extinction, like, the mass extinction of human beings. But it doesn't have to be that, right? It could simply be, it could simply look like a depopulation event where, no longer you're making a choice to not have kids. Now, 8 billion people shrinks down to 4 to 3 to 2. I mean, whatever. As that's happening, you would probably have billions of climate refugees. You would have wars, and eventually I think pretty much any kind of because just kind of the nature of what human beings are like, I can imagine human beings just always finding a way to exist and eventually restart a civilization. Like I can't imagine, for instance, like no more human beings, right? But the discussion tends to be one of like the deniers, right? They tend to exaggerate to the stakes to the point of like pure extinction events, right? Which is like now you don't have to talk about actually the things, right, that need to be talked about, right? It's just like another way of like avoiding conversation. And I guess the last thing I would ask here is so like what do you think about like the rhetoric surrounding climate? Like I saw recently this thread by this like I guess you call him like a progressive historian who said something like, I think degrowth is like the worst thing that's ever happened to the left. Like it's just such a bad phrase, right? And I guess, I mean, in many respects, like degrowth probably is terrible as a phrase, simply because like the same people, that say degrowth would be the types to, like, there's one guy, I forget his name, that is like, he's always talking about degrowth, but he often writes articles like degrowth radical abundance. It's like, okay, choose one, degrowth or radical abundance, right? Don't confuse people, right? So I think there's something to the critique of how that's the thing. The people that are talking about degrowth are the people that are most likely the correct ones in terms of like saying, okay, eventually we're going to have to converge on a standard of living where the global north is going to have to experience a contraction, global south is going to have to experience like a leg up, and eventually we find a baseline. We're going to have to find a way to reallocate. Like they tend to be correct about that, but the way that they're discussing it might very well be like off the mark. Like, what do you think about all that?
Yeah, I mean, totally. Like, it's not, I don't like that terminal. Okay. So I think that like most people's responses to the degrowth language or whatever illustrates exactly that thing we were talking about, where they're just like, it's just childish. I mean, they're just like, no, there's no limits. There's no limits, right? It's just that psychology. But at the same time, like, yeah, I don't like that phrasing was never like the thing that I was into. And even though maybe this seems like a little bit like a rhetorical flourish or something, but like for me, what's true is that even though like it is strictly speaking absolutely the case that I totally want very significant contractions of like the existing types of resource intensity that comprise the economy, at the same time I'm like super interested in, I don't know, kind of like pursuing novel possibilities for life, right? Like for like I do actually have this real sense of progress, right? That's like I'm so interested in the evolutionary journey and like the sense that we are on this trajectory of like ever greater sort of like complexity and knowledge of how things work, and like kind of on the most fundamental terms, like that we are this case of the universe becoming more and more aware of its own dynamics. And like, so like I'm like a real progress guy. Like I'm like a militant ecologist or whatever, but I'm also like, it's like I want us to like genetically engineer fungi that become our building materials and like sequester massive amounts of greenhouse gas with like new species that photosynthesize at 100% efficiency and stuff like that. It's like, so I guess like to me that's like more the right kind of like framing, like the right emphasis is in this like sense of undiscovered possibility. And the degrowth thing to me does just kind of imply like, okay, like we've exhausted the range of exploration and now let's just like contract. And I'm like, nah, that doesn't like, it doesn't really appeal to me either, even though most of I do find the responses childish. I'm like, yeah, it's not an appealing frame at all.
Yeah, it's one of those things where there may be so many people out there that are just like fundamentally correct, right? Like again, I do believe in this like arrow of progress, right? At the same time, everyone that is arguing for an arrow of progress now suddenly has like all these new incentives to ignore periods of stagnation, right? And to pretend that a certain, a piece of stagnation is not actually stagnation, right? It's just a wrong, you get married to these like theories, and you get married like just one of the most like liberating things I've noticed in my own life is just kind of like discarding a lot of these labels, but also just like, yeah, I mean, I tell people all the time, like, yeah, I'm not a Marxist or a communist, but 5 centuries from now, I can't imagine that society looks closer to capitalism than it does to like, unfettered communism, right? It's probably going to be closer to the latter, right? But you don't have to, you don't have to now wed yourself like, all right, now I have to think about things in this way. Now everything has to be done under the rubric of like communism right now today. Like it's just, you have to sort of be able to accept things in stages, which means you have to be absolutely hyper focused on what's happening around you right now. So you know exactly where you are, right? You could identify where you're climbing, where you're falling, and not, not ignore that. All right, so maybe we could close this out and move to the patron only show. Again, we're gonna talk about New Orleans. We're gonna talk about I want to talk more about Russia, Ukraine, and where this stands, kind of like civilization, like why did it happen now? Like there's something weirdly symbolic about all this. My own kind of like little history there. Left, right, divide, Sasquatch, right? I want to IQ. Oh, IQ. We're gonna.
We got to talk about IQ.
IQ, and penis size, right?
Right.
But not in the way that normally IQ fetishists think about IQ penis size, right? It's the fact that because it's no longer cool to measure penises, they're measuring IQs now, right? As a kind of as a kind of a surrogate. So, all right, thank you guys for watching, and for the patrons, please stick around.